The church doors had been open for 20 minutes, and Jane Harper had not moved a single step inside. She stood at the very back, pressed against the rough-hewn doorframe, her fingers gripping the worn wood so tightly that splinters bit into her palms. She did not feel them. She felt nothing except the roaring in her ears and the unbearable weight of every set of eyes that had turned to look at her when she appeared in the doorway. The entire congregation of Dusty Creek, Texas, had gone silent in an instant, the way a prairie goes silent just before a twister drops from the sky. At the front of the church, a man stood waiting, not the man she had come to marry. Man she had come to face. Reverend Hollis, his white collar gleaming in the morning light filtering through the single stained-glass window the town had been so proud to import from St. Louis, shifted his weight from foot to foot. His Bible trembled slightly in his hands. He knew. Half the congregation knew. The other half were about to find out, and the knowing of it sat in Jane's chest like a hot coal she could not cough up. Then the man at the front of the church moved. Not the reverend, not the appointed groom. Not the man who had arranged this entire ceremony with the precision of a trap being set. Joseph Ashford. He had been sitting in the first pew, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hat resting on the bench beside him. He was not supposed to be a central figure in this moment. He was supposed to be a witness, a formality, a name on a piece of paper. But Joseph Ashford stood up, turned around, and looked the full length of that aisle directly at Jane Harper. The distance between them was no more than 40 feet. It might as well have been a canyon. He did not hesitate. He did not look at the reverend, did not look at the people watching with open mouths and whispered words already forming on their lips. He put one boot in front of the other and he walked. He walked the full length of that aisle, toward her. And every step he took toward the back of that church was a step away from the carefully constructed lie that had brought them both to Dusty Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and a step toward the truth that neither of them had been brave enough to speak out loud until right now. Jane's grip on the doorframe loosened. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs like a caged animal, shifted just slightly into something that felt less like terror and more like the terrifying, wonderful possibility of being saved. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine dust on his shoulders from the ride in that morning, close enough to see that his jaw was set hard, the way it always got when he had made a decision and intended to see it through. His eyes were steady on hers, dark brown and serious and full of something he had never once permitted himself to say. "Jane," he said, one word, her name. And in it was everything, the dark past they had both been running from, the secret she had been carrying since October, the forced choice that had been engineered by a man who thought he owned the future, and the one truth that had been growing silently between her and Joseph Ashford for months like a wildflower pushing through cracked hardpan. She did not speak. He held out his hand. And there, with the reverend staring, with the congregation holding its collective breath, with the man at the front of the church, finally beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong for him, Jane Harper looked at Joseph Ashford's outstretched hand and made the most consequential decision of her 24 years of life. But to understand why that hand meant everything, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to October. The town of Dusty Creek sat in the eastern portion of the Texas Panhandle, a place where the sky was so big it seemed to lean on you from every direction. In the autumn of 1881, it was a town still finding its footing, a cattle drive stop that had made a bid for permanence with a general store, a telegraph office, a church, a schoolhouse, a sheriff's office, and 3 saloons, because the frontier always built its vices before its virtues. The population sat at somewhere between 200 and 300 souls, depending on whether you counted the ranchers in the outlying lands, which everyone generally did when they wanted the town to sound impressive, and did not when they were trying to keep the tax roll manageable. Jane Harper arrived in Dusty Creek on the 3rd day of October, 1881, on the back of a freight wagon, which was not the most dignified arrival she had ever imagined for herself. But then dignity had stopped being the foremost concern in her life sometime around the moment. She had climbed out of a second-story window in Abilene with a carpetbag and no particular plan. She had $22, a change of clothes, a bone-handled knife her father had pressed into her hand when she was 9 years old and told her to always keep close, and a letter of introduction from a woman named Clara Bright in Abilene, who ran a boarding house and had been quietly funneling desperate women toward better circumstances for 15 years. Clara had said there was work in Dusty Creek at the general store owned by a man named Gerald Whitmore, that he was respectable and fair, and that the town needed a woman who could keep accounts. Jane could keep accounts. She had been keeping accounts for her father's dry goods store in Missouri since she was 12, and she had later kept the books for 2 different businesses in Abilene, before circumstances in Abilene had become the kind of circumstances you climbed out of second-story windows to escape. She did not think about that as the wagon rolled into Dusty Creek. She looked at the wide, dusty street, the hitching posts with their patient horses, the women moving between doorways with baskets and purposeful steps, the men in their broad-brimmed hats, and she thought, "This is a place, a real place. I can make something of a real place." Gerald Whitmore turned out to be 62 years old, a widower with a slight stoop, and a habit of chewing the end of his pencil when he was thinking. He had watery blue eyes and enormous white mustaches, and was, in fact, entirely respectable and fair, exactly as Clara had promised. He hired Jane within 10 minutes of her presenting herself in Clara's letter, showed her to the small room at the back of the store he used as a stockroom, and which he had clearly attempted to make habitable in anticipation of her arrival. There was a cot, a washstand, a small mirror, and a hook on the wall, all of which represented a profound upgrade from the wagon bench she had spent the last 3 days on. "Supper's at the boarding house 2 doors down," Gerald said, picking up a pencil and immediately putting the end of it in his mouth. "Mrs. Abel keeps a good table. You'll eat there with the others. I'll settle it in your wages." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Jane said. "You'll find the ledgers in a state," he warned her. "My eyesight's not what it was." He was not wrong. The ledgers were in a profound state. Jane spent her first 3 days in Dusty Creek untangling 6 months of accounts, and by the time she surfaced from the numbers, she had a reasonably complete picture of the commercial life of the town, knew the names of most of the regular customers, and had begun to feel, cautiously and tentatively, that she might be allowed to be safe here. It was on her 4th day, a Saturday, when she first encountered Joseph Ashford. He came into the store in the late afternoon, when the light was coming gold and sideways through the front windows. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that suggested a man who worked hard every day and never sat still long enough to go soft. His dark hair was slightly longer than was fashionable, curling a little at the back of his collar. He had a straight nose and a strong jaw and hands that bore the calluses and minor scars of a working life. He was, Jane noted in the purely observational way she had learned to note things about men, the kind of handsome that did not announce itself, that crept up on you when you were paying attention to something else. He came to the counter with a list, a real list, written in a clear, even hand, and he looked at her with a slight expression of surprise, because the last time he had been in the store, presumably, Gerald had been behind the counter. "Help you?" Jane said in her best professionally neutral voice. "I expect so," he said. He put the list on the counter. "I'm Joseph Ashford. I run the Ashford spread about 8 miles north." "Jane Harper," she said. She picked up his list and read through it. "I have everything here except the number 4 horseshoe nails. We're waiting on a supply order from Amarillo. When do you expect it?" "Tuesday if the weather holds." "I'll come back Tuesday then." He was not looking at the list anymore. He was looking at her with the kind of look that was not rude or forward, but was assessing in a way that was, she had to admit, being returned in kind. "You're new." "About 4 days new," she said. Dusty Creek treating you well? So far, ask me in a month. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile or not quite only a smile. Something warmer and more complicated than that. Fair enough, he said. He collected what was available, settled his account, she had his file, and confirmed he was paid in full, a point in his favor, and left. Jane watched him go out of the corner of her eye and then returned her attention to the ledger she had been working on. She thought about him again later that night, for no particular reason she cared to examine. He came back on Tuesday. The horseshoe nails had arrived. He paid for them, exchanged 3 sentences with Gerald about the condition of the road north, and said to Jane, on his way out, "Dusty Creek still treating you well?" "Better," she said. "Ask me in another month." This time he did smile. It happened quickly, like a window opening and closing, but she caught it. He came back the following Friday with another list, which she could have told him was inefficient since Tuesday was their main delivery day, and anything on a Friday list that wasn't in stock would sit until the following Tuesday. But she didn't say it because it was not, she thought, actually about the efficiency of his supply purchasing. By the end of October, Joseph Ashford was coming into Whitmore's general store twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and at least one of those visits involved no purchasing at all, only conversation conducted across the wooden counter with the careful, measured quality of 2 people who are both being very deliberate about not saying certain things too quickly. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, gradually, through repeated exposure, one feature becoming clear and then another. He was 28 years old. He had come to Texas from Virginia in 1876, at 23, with a small inheritance from his father and the intention to build something that was entirely his own, not because his family had been unkind to him, but because he needed to know he could. He had bought 160 acres of grazing land at a price that reflected the considerable risk involved in the transaction, increased it to 340 over the following years, and now ran a cattle operation that was not large by the standards of the great Texas ranches, but was solid and growing and entirely debt-free. He had 2 ranch hands, a Mexican man named Carlos who had been with him since the 2nd year and who could fix anything made of wood or metal, and a younger man from Ohio named Pete who had a way with horses that bordered on the supernatural. He had never married. He had come close, he said once carefully, looking at a point slightly to the left of her face, 4 years ago, and then he said nothing further about it, and Jane did not ask, because she had things she was not yet ready to talk about either. What he did not know, and what Jane had been carrying like a stone since the first week in October, was why she had really left Abilene. She had not only left because of general difficult circumstances. She had left because of a man named Douglas Crane. Douglas Crane was 38 years old, 6 feet tall, and the sort of man who could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel that they existed at his pleasure. He had come to Abilene in the spring of 1881 with a freight business and a flattering manner, and a great deal of very visible money, and he had fixed his attention on Jane Harper with the specific, concentrated quality of a man who was accustomed to acquiring whatever he wanted. Jane had been flattered, initially. She was honest with herself about this, lonely and tired and looking for something she could not quite name, and Douglas Crane had seemed to offer it. He was charming and generous and attentive in those early months, and she had genuinely believed herself to be falling in love with him. Then she had started noticing things. The way he spoke to servants and workers, courteous when observed, contemptuous when not. The way he gathered information about people he encountered, carefully, almost invisibly, building up a store of knowledge about vulnerabilities and obligations and secrets that could later be employed. The way he had, over 6 months, very gradually and very skillfully, made himself indispensable to her life in ways that would make it very difficult to walk away. She worked for a business he had become a significant creditor of. She lived in a house he had quietly taken over the lease on. Her name was on a contract she had signed without fully reading at a time when she had trusted him entirely. By the time she understood what he was, she was in a position that was not, technically, a trap, because nothing about it was technically illegal, but functioned exactly like one. She had spent 2 months in Abilene planning her exit with the same careful attention she gave to ledgers, and when she climbed out of that second-story window, she had done it in the absolute certainty that Douglas Crane would not immediately know where she had gone, and the corresponding certainty that he would eventually find out. Because Douglas Crane, she had learned, did not let things go. She had been in Dusty Creek for 6 weeks when the letter arrived. It was addressed to Gerald Whitmore, not to her, which was why it sat on the desk for 2 days before Gerald opened it and called Jane in from behind the counter with an expression on his face that she could not quite read, somewhere between uncomfortable and guilty, and something that might have been pity. The letter was from Douglas Crane. It was politely worded, as his communications always were. It established that he had a prior acquaintance with Miss Jane Harper, currently employed at Whitmore's General Store, and that he had reason to believe she had left Abilene under a misunderstanding that he was most anxious to resolve. It included, delicately but unmistakably, a reference to the contract Jane had signed, and suggested that her current employment situation would benefit from his goodwill in the matter of that contract's terms. He was coming to Dusty Creek. He would be there by the end of November. Jane read the letter twice, folded it precisely, and handed it back to Gerald. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "I expect you do," he said, not unkindly. "But sit down first." She told him as much of the truth as was necessary, which was most of it. Gerald chewed his pencil and listened and did not interrupt. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This contract he mentions," he said. "It concerns a debt on a business in Abilene," she said. "I co-signed a loan as a courtesy for the owner because Douglas asked me to, and I was foolish enough to trust him. If he calls it in, the business owner could be ruined. He knows that I know that. He thinks it will bring me back." "Will it?" "No," she said, and meant it absolutely. Gerald nodded slowly. "Then we'll have to think," he said. What neither of them knew, in that moment, was that the information in Gerald's letter was already circulating in a much wider circle. Douglas Crane had sent similar letters, or had had conversations that amounted to them, to enough people in Dusty Creek that by the time he arrived, at the very end of November, he had already established a preliminary social presence in the town. He had taken a room at the Dusty Creek Hotel, which was the best accommodation available, and he arrived in a fine black coat and with the manner of a man making a business trip rather than a personal pursuit, and within a week he had become a fixture at the better end of Dusty Creek's social life. He was, Jane had to acknowledge, very good at this. He did not approach her directly at first. He came into the store, bought items with perfect politeness, treated her with the studious courtesy of a man who had no claim on her and was not pressing one. He attended church. He donated generously to the fund for the new church bell that Reverend Hollies had been collecting toward for 2 years. He had dinner at the better table of Mrs. Abel's boarding house, where the ranchers and the more established townsfolk ate, and he talked about cattle prices and railroad routes and the reliability of the telegraph service. And he was, by all the evidence available to a town that did not know him, a perfectly decent and prosperous man. Jane watched all of this with a cold, clear-eyed dread. She knew what he was doing. He was building the social architecture of a situation. He was making himself into a known and respected quantity so that, when the moment came, when he finally made his play, it would be surrounded by the credibility he had constructed, and she would be the one standing against it with nothing but her word. It was in the second week of December that Joseph Ashford came into the store and found Jane standing very still behind the counter, holding a piece of paper and staring at the wall with an expression that he later described, when telling her about it afterward, as the most frightening thing he had seen since a wildfire came within 100 yards of his south pasture in the summer of 1879. "Jane," he said. She looked up. "Something wrong?" She hesitated. She had been hesitating for 2 months, because asking for help was not something that came easily to a woman who had spent most of her adult life being told, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that asking for help was a weakness that would be used against her. She had been managing this alone, and she had a plan, sort of, and it was not a good plan, but it was the plan she had. But Joseph Ashford was standing in front of her with the direct, steady look he always had, the one that did not make demands but also did not look away, and she was very tired. "Close the door," she said. He did. She told him everything. It took longer than she expected, not because the story was complicated. It was, in its essential architecture, quite simple, but because the act of telling it unearthed things she had not known she was carrying. She told him about Douglas Crane and the contract in Abilene and the second-story window, and she told him about the letters, and she told him about the careful, systematic social campaign Douglas was running in Dusty Creek, and she told him what she was afraid of, which was not Douglas himself so much as the mechanism he had constructed, the way he made other people into the instruments of his will without their fully knowing they were being used. Joseph listened without interrupting, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his expression going through a series of changes she catalogued as concern, comprehension, anger, controlled, deeper comprehension, and finally a kind of settled determination. "What's the contract say exactly?" he asked when she was done. She told him. "The business owner in Abilene, do they know? I wrote to them in October. They know the debt exists. They don't know Douglas has been threatening to call it in." "Write to them again," he said. "Tell them to be ready." "Ready for what?" He unfolded his arms. "I know a lawyer in Amarillo," he said. "Name's James Whitfield. He spent the last 10 years in contract law, mostly land disputes. He can look at what you signed and tell us whether it's actually enforceable or whether it's a bluff." Jane felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first tentative movement toward it. That could take time. It could, but knowing the truth of what you're dealing with is worth the time. "And in the meantime," he looked at her steadily, "in the meantime, you're not alone in this. That matters." She held his gaze for a moment, and the thing that moved between them in that moment was not romantic, exactly, or was not only romantic. It was something older and more fundamental than romance. The recognition of one person by another as someone who could be trusted absolutely, and that recognition was, she thought, the foundation on which everything else between them would eventually be built. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Write the letter to Amarillo first." She wrote it that night at Gerald's desk, by lamplight. Joseph had provided the address. She wrote it carefully, laying out the facts of her situation with the same precise attention she gave to accounts, and when she was finished, she read it through twice and sealed it and walked it to the telegraph office herself first thing the following morning. James Whitfield's response came in 10 days, which was, Jane thought, either a testament to the efficiency of the Texas telegraph system or to the fact that Joseph Ashford had sent his own communication to Amarillo in addition to hers. The contract, Whitfield wrote, was likely enforceable in the limited sense that the debt was real and Jane's signature was genuine. However, and this was the critical however, the contract had a specific clause regarding the timeline of any call on the debt, and that clause, as written, gave the business owner in Abilene 60 days' notice, during which the debt could be refinanced through any willing third party. If a third party could be found to buy out the debt on favorable terms, Douglas Crane's leverage evaporated completely. The question was finding the money. Jane did not have it. The sum in question was $480, which was not an astronomical figure in the context of the larger Texas land economy, but was, for a woman who had arrived in Dusty Creek with $22 and had been accumulating wages for 2 months, completely beyond reach. She was still working through this calculation, trying to see if there was any combination of events that could produce $480 in time, when Joseph came into the store 3 days before Christmas and put $480 in cash on the counter. Jane stared at it. "No," she said. "Yes," he said with calm finality. "Joseph, I cannot take $480 from you." "You're not taking it," he said. "You're borrowing it. I've written a promissory note at 0% interest with no fixed repayment date and the stipulation that if you choose at any time to settle it in kind, meaning labor at the going rate for a skilled bookkeeper, we'll call it square." He put a folded piece of paper on top of the cash. "That's the note. Sign it if you want to. Don't sign it if you don't. Either way, the money's there." Jane looked at the money and at the note and at him. "Why?" she asked. He met her eyes. There was a long beat of silence in the store, and in that silence was everything that had been accumulating between them in 2.5 months of twice-weekly conversations across a wooden counter, and everything that neither of them had said, and all of it was present and accounted for in the air between them. "Because it's the right thing," he said. Which was true, but was not all of it, and they both knew it, and neither of them said the other part yet, because it was December and they were both people who moved carefully. The money went to Abilene by wire transfer through the Dusty Creek Bank, with a letter from James Whitfield's office establishing the terms of the debt buyout, and the whole thing was concluded before the new year. The business owner in Abilene, a woman named Martha Greer who ran a millinery shop and who had been sick with worry for months, wrote Jane a letter so full of relief and gratitude that Jane had to sit down when she read it. Douglas Crane found out on the 3rd of January. He came into Whitmore's general store with, for the first time, none of his careful social polish in evidence. There was something bare and cold in his face that Jane recognized from the very last days in Abilene when she had finally stopped pretending she did not see what he was. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been working," she said. She kept her voice level. She had thought about this moment a great deal. "The Abilene debt is settled," he said. "It is. You had help." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. He was, she could see, recalculating. Douglas Crane was always recalculating. It was how his mind worked. "It doesn't change the fundamental situation," he said. "What fundamental situation is that? Your situation here is temporary. You know that. You'll need to move on eventually, and when you do, your options will be—" "Mr. Crane," she said. He stopped. "I've settled the debt," she said. "I have employment, I have a room, and I have no obligation to you of any kind. If you choose to remain in Dusty Creek for your own reasons, that is your affair, but I'd like you to leave my workplace now." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read. There was anger in it, but also something that might almost have been admiration, which she found deeply uncomfortable. "Who provided the money?" he asked. She said nothing. He smiled slightly. "I see," he said. He put on his hat. "Give my regards to Mr. Ashford." He left. Jane let out a breath that she had apparently been holding since he walked in, and then she straightened her back and returned to the ledger she had been working on. She thought he might leave after that. She hoped he might leave. The leverage was gone, the contract was settled. There was no obvious reason for him to remain in Dusty Creek. But Douglas Crane did not leave. He remained through January and through February, and in that time he continued his social campaign with undiminished energy. He made himself more visible, if anything. He appeared at every social function, made additional donations to the church fund, and most alarming to Jane, who watched all of this with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read the warning signs of a particular kind of storm. He began speaking openly and publicly about his regard for Jane Harper, not in an aggressive or possessive way, in the worst possible way, in a romantic way. He spoke of her as a woman of great character and ability, and of his long-standing affection for her, and of his hope that she might one day be persuaded to take his name. He framed the story of her departure from Abilene when asked, and he subtly engineered being asked, as a misunderstanding born of a difficult period in both their lives, which he hoped time and patience might repair. He was building something. Jane could see the architecture of it clearly. He was constructing a social narrative in which he was the devoted, patient suitor, and she was the woman who had run away from love and would eventually, with the gentle encouragement of her community, come to her senses. It was masterful, she thought, in the way that a well-made trap is masterful. You could see the craftsmanship and still be caught by it. By March, the pressure was becoming concrete. Mrs. Abel, who kept the boarding house where Jane ate, began mentioning Douglas Crane at supper with a warmth that made Jane's stomach turn. Reverend Hollies, buoyed by the new church bell that Douglas's donation had largely funded, spoke of him in terms that made clear he considered the man a pillar of the community in formation. Two of the women who had been most friendly to Jane since her arrival began gently kindly, even, which made it worse, to suggest that refusing a man of Douglas Crane's standing and evident devotion was not perhaps in Jane's long-term interest. Jane held the line. She was polite and firm and gave nothing away. But she felt it, the slow, inexorable social pressure of a small community that was being carefully managed by a man who understood how communities worked and how women within them could be slowly, imperceptibly pushed. And then, in the second week of March, Douglas Crane called on Gerald Whitmore. Gerald told her about it himself, that same afternoon, sitting behind his desk and looking at her over his pencil with an expression of profound discomfort. Douglas had been, Gerald said, very correct and very businesslike. He had expressed his admiration for Jane and his intention to marry her, and he had then noted, carefully, and with every appearance of simple honesty, that he had a business interest in several operations along the supply route through which Whitmore's primary goods arrived from Amarillo, and that his goodwill in those operations was a material benefit to Gerald's continued competitive pricing. It was not a threat. It was not a threat in the same way that a gun on the table during a negotiation is not a threat. Technically, it is just resting there. Gerald had not given Douglas any commitments. He had shown him out politely and then sat very still for several minutes. "I won't be coerced," Gerald told Jane now. "I want you to know that." "I know," she said, "but I want you to know the situation." "I know the situation," she said. She was very calm. She had learned to be calm when she was most afraid. "Thank you for telling me." She walked home to her small room that night through the cold March air, and sat on her cot and looked at the wall and thought about the specific quality of powerlessness that comes not from violence or direct confrontation, but from the patient, incremental construction of circumstances that leave you no good options. She had escaped Abilene. She had thought she had escaped Douglas Crane. And here he was, and here was the cage, newly built but recognizable in its design. She was still sitting there when a knock came at the small back door of the store. She opened it, and Joseph Ashford was standing in the dark, holding his hat. "Gerald came to see me," he said. "Of course he did," she said without surprise. "Can I come in?" She moved aside. He came in, looked at the small spare room with its cot and washstand and single hook, and sat on the stool that served as a chair without being asked. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she said, sitting on the edge of the cot, "that I made a mistake in believing that settling the contract would be enough to make him leave. I underestimated how much he does not want to lose." "What does he want, really?" She considered this. "He wants to win," she said finally. "He doesn't love me. I don't think he's capable of it. What he wants is the specific satisfaction of having me choose him publicly after having run from him. He wants the story where he was right and I was wrong." Joseph turned his hat in his hands. It was a habit he had when he was thinking hard, she had noticed. "Then the answer is not to give him that story," he said. "That's a theory," she said. "The practice of it is harder." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something. She had learned to read the quality of his silences, which varied considerably. This was the silence of a man who was about to say something he had been working himself up to for some time. "I have a thought," he said, "but it's a large thought and I need you to hear all of it before you answer." She waited. If you were married, he said carefully, to someone else, someone Dusty Creek knows and respects. The story Crane is building falls apart. He can't position himself as the patient, devoted suitor if there is no available object of that devotion. And a married woman with a husband of standing in this community is not a woman he can maneuver with social pressure. She looked at him. She was very careful with her face. "Are you proposing to me as a strategy?" she said. "No," he said. He met her eyes directly with the steady, unflinching directness that was one of the most distinctive things about him. "I'm telling you why it would be practical, but I'm asking you because I want to." The room was very quiet. Outside, the March wind moved along the side of the building with a low sound. "Joseph," she said, "I have been in a situation before where what looked like someone wanting something was actually something else." "I know," he said. "And I know why you'd think that now. I'm not Douglas Crane." "I know you're not," she said immediately, with a certainty that surprised her in its depth. Then he stopped, tried again. "I have been coming into this store 2 and 3 times a week for 5 months," he said, "and I am not a man who goes to town 3 times a week. The nearest I've had to a social life in the last 3 years has been occasional dinners with Carlos and Pete, and arguing with Carlos about the best way to mend a fence. I come here because you're here. I come here because talking to you is the best part of my week and has been since October." He paused. "That's what's true. The practical argument is also true. But it's not the reason." She sat with that for a long moment. There were things she had been trying not to feel for several months, and the act of not feeling them had required a low-level constant effort that she had not fully appreciated until she let it stop. And sitting here on the edge of her cot in her cold little room with Joseph Ashford on the stool turning his hat in his hands and looking at her with that completely honest expression, she let it stop. "I have feelings for you," she said. "I have had feelings for you for quite some time. I have been trying to be sensible about it because my judgment in this area has not historically been reliable." "Your judgment is fine," he said. "You were deceived by someone who is expert at deception. That's different." "I know the difference now," she said, "somewhat better than I used to." "Then," he said, she looked at him. She thought about October and the freight wagon and the $22 and the cold, careful terror of starting over. And she thought about November and December and the twice-weekly conversations across the counter and the way she felt when she heard the door and it was him. And she thought about $480 placed on the counter without any condition that she could not accept. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked startled for the first time since he had come in. Then something happened to his expression that was one of the finest things she had ever seen on a human face, something between laughter and the kind of tenderness that operates at a depth below the ordinary range of social interaction. He put his hat aside. He leaned forward on the stool, both elbows on his knees. "Jane Harper," he said, "I would very much like you to marry me, not for the practical reason, though it's real. Because you are the most level-headed and honest and quietly brave person I have encountered in my life, and because you make the world make more sense when you're in it, and because I believe we could be genuinely, substantially happy together." She let out a breath. "Yes," she said. "Joseph Ashford, yes." He reached out and took her hand, and that was all, and it was enough. They told Gerald the following morning. He chewed his pencil in deep thought for approximately 30 seconds and then said, "Well, that's been coming for 4 months, with the air of a man confirming a financial prediction." They told no one else immediately. Not yet. Because they were not yet ready, and because they needed to be ready before Douglas Crane had the chance to respond. The plan, as it developed over the following 2 weeks with input from Joseph, Jane, Gerald, and a brief additional telegraph consultation with James Whitfield in Amarillo, was straightforward in structure and somewhat terrifying in execution. They would file for marriage. They would arrange the ceremony at the church with Reverend Hollies. They would give Douglas Crane no advance notice, which meant keeping the plan within a very tight circle. And they would rely on the fact that in a community like Dusty Creek, a wedding was a public and permanent social fact that could not be easily re-narrated after the event. The plan had one significant flaw, which was that Douglas Crane had been in Dusty Creek long enough to develop his own sources of information, and that information, as it turned out, moved faster than Jane had anticipated. She found out how fast on the morning of the wedding. The ceremony had been scheduled for 10 o'clock, on a Tuesday in the middle of April, 1882. Jane had a dress, not a grand one, but clean and well-made. The dark green wool of her best dress altered by a woman named Rosie Chavez, who was the finest seamstress in Dusty Creek, and who had been brought into the secret circle, and had taken the whole enterprise with the gleeful seriousness of a woman who recognized injustice when she saw it. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours before the ceremony, Jane answered a knock at the back door of the store and found a man she did not recognize, a rider, trail-dusted, with a sealed letter. The letter was from Douglas Crane. It had been written the previous evening. It was not a threat. It was, in its way, something worse than a threat. It was a declaration of intent, written in Douglas's careful, formal hand, informing her that he was aware of the planned marriage, that he considered it a hasty and irrational decision made under duress, and that he intended to attend the ceremony and make his position known before the congregation, and that he was confident the community of Dusty Creek, properly informed of the full circumstances of their acquaintance, would support his claim on her future. He was not going to prevent the wedding by force. He was going to prevent it by social pressure, by standing in front of a congregation and presenting his version of her history, the version in which she was confused and frightened and had made a hasty decision, and by counting on the weight of community opinion to do the rest. Jane stood in the cold morning air with the letter in her hands and felt the trap close, and then she felt something else. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She finished dressing. She put on the green wool dress that Rosie had altered. She put on her good boots. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall of her room and she thought, "He is counting on me to be afraid." He has always been counting on that. She walked to the church. The congregation of Dusty Creek, or most of it, was assembled in the pews when she arrived. Joseph was at the front with Reverend Hollis and Gerald, who was serving as a witness. Carlos and Pete were there, and Rosie Chavez, and several others who had been quietly on Jane's side of this situation since they had begun to understand it. And Douglas Crane was there. Seated in the fourth pew, perfectly turned out, with the expression of a man who has laid his plans carefully. Jane stopped at the back of the church. She had intended to walk down that aisle with confidence, and she stood at the back and found that confidence had a different shape than she had expected. Not absent exactly, but the weight of it, the weight of all the eyes, the weight of Douglas Crane sitting in the fourth pew with that calculated expression, the weight of months of careful pressure, was more than she had steeled herself for in the privacy of her room. She stopped, and she stood. She could feel the congregation's attention shifting between her and the front of the church. She could see Reverend Hollis leaning slightly toward Joseph with a murmured something, and she could see Joseph turn. He turned fully around. He looked the full length of the aisle. He looked at her. And in the moment that he looked at her standing frozen at the back of that church with the morning light coming through the open doors behind her and illuminating the dust motes in the air, he understood everything. He understood the letter she had received. He understood what Douglas Crane was positioned to do. He understood what it had cost her to walk even this far and what was making her stop. He did not stay at the front of the church. He walked. He put one boot in front of the other and he came down that aisle, past the fourth pew where Douglas Crane sat with his expression of satisfaction beginning to solidify, past the fifth and sixth and seventh pews, past the congregation whose murmuring had died to complete silence, all the way to the back of the church where Jane Harper stood in her green dress with her hands gripping the doorframe. He stopped in front of her. "Jane," he said. His hand came up open, palm up, offered. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She looked at the open, honest, completely steadfast expression on it, and she thought of everything he had never once asked of her, not gratitude, not explanation, not surrender of any kind, and of everything he had simply given. Money, time, presence, honesty, this walk down the aisle, this refusal to let her stand alone at the back. She released the doorframe. She put her hand in his. He walked back up the aisle with her hand in his, and she walked beside him, and the quality of what moved through her as they walked was not triumph. Exactly, though there was something of that and not relief, though there was a great deal of that, it was something simpler and deeper, the feeling of having been seen completely and chosen anyway, which is the most fundamental form of love there is. They passed the fourth pew. Douglas Crane sat very still. He was, she would later think, a man who had made a precise calculation and found that one variable was incorrect. He had calculated that Jane Harper would stop at the back of the church. He had not calculated for Joseph Ashford. They reached the front. Reverend Hollis opened his Bible. Gerald blew his nose discreetly. Douglas Crane sat through the first 2 minutes of the ceremony and then stood, smoothed his coat, and walked out of the church without a word. The door swung shut behind him. Not one person in the congregation moved. Reverend Hollis cleared his throat. He looked at Joseph and at Jane and at their joined hands and at the door that had just shut. "Shall we begin?" he said. "Please," said Joseph Ashford. The ceremony was not long. The words were the traditional ones, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, and they meant everything. When Joseph said the vows, he said them in his usual direct, unhurried manner, looking at Jane with the expression she had been learning to read since October and understood now completely. When Jane said her vows, her voice was steady and clear. She had made her decision. She was not afraid. When it was done, when Reverend Hollis pronounced them married and closed his Bible and allowed himself a small private smile, the congregation, which had been as tightly coiled as a spring for the last 20 minutes, released in one communal exhale of something between relief and celebration. People were on their feet. Carlos let out a sound that was, for a reserved man, the equivalent of a shout. Pete, who was 23 and sentimental, appeared to be crying, which he later vigorously denied. Rosie Chavez caught Jane's eye and pressed both hands to her heart. Joseph and Jane stood at the front of the church and received congratulations, and at some point, in the press of people and the noise, Joseph's hand found hers again, not as a gesture, not for the ceremony, just because, and she held on. Douglas Crane's horse was gone from the hitching post outside the church by the time the congregation emerged into the April sunlight. His room at the Dusty Creek Hotel was vacated by that afternoon. He did not come back, and his departure, like everything else about him, was total and clean, the departure of a man who understood when an enterprise had failed and saw no value in sentiment. James Whitfield confirmed, in a letter that arrived 3 weeks later, that the debt in Abilene remained fully retired and that there were no outstanding legal claims. Martha Greer wrote from her millinery shop in Abilene to say that the shop was prospering and that she had been told of the marriage and wished Jane every happiness. Jane read that letter 3 times. The first months of their marriage had the quality of 2 people learning a new geography. Joseph's ranch house was a good house, well built, 4 rooms, with a porch facing west that caught the evening light in a way that Jane found immediately and profoundly restoring. Carlos and Pete had been with Joseph long enough to have formed their own relationship with the household, and they absorbed the addition of Jane with the pragmatic ease of working men who understood that a good arrangement had just become better. Jane continued working at the store through the summer, partly because the accounts needed her and partly because Gerald, whose eyesight was genuinely deteriorating, had come to rely on her completely, and she was not the kind of person who could simply leave an arrangement that someone depended on. But she also began taking on the books for the ranch, which had been Joseph's particular burden, and which he was genuinely relieved to hand over, not because he was incapable, but because his time was better spent on the 1,000 other demands of a working cattle operation. She discovered things about him in those first months that she had not fully known. The way he moved through a working day, which had an unhurried efficiency she admired enormously. The way he treated Carlos and Pete, which was with a matter-of-fact respect that she recognized as a moral position rather than a performance. And the way he looked, in the evenings on the west-facing porch, at the darkening sky over the panhandle, with an expression of quiet contentment. That was one of the most private and most given things she had ever been trusted to see. She also discovered, more gradually, the specific quality of the thing that had been close, 4 years ago, that he had mentioned once in the store and left incomplete. His name was not volunteered, but in time she understood that there had been a woman in Virginia before he left, and that the closeness had not been mutual, that he had offered something and it had not been received, and that this was part of what had sent him west with such determination, the need to build something in a place where that particular failure had no echo. She did not say much about it when she finally understood it. She said one evening on the porch, "You never got the thing wrong, you know." She did. He looked at her. "What brought that up?" "I've been thinking about the sequence," she said, "the whole story of how you got here." He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing its thing over the panhandle, which was spectacular in a way that still caught Jane by the throat even after months of watching it. "You've been thinking about my history," he said. "I think about a lot of things." "I know you do." He reached over and took her hand, which was resting on the porch railing. "I got here," he said. "That's what matters." "Yes," she said, "you got here." They sat in the evening light and held hands, and it was one of the best moments she had collected. By August, the town of Dusty Creek had made its peace with the whole episode in the way that small communities do, by absorbing it into the communal narrative, softening some edges, sharpening others, and arriving at a version of events that was broadly accurate, and which, in the retelling, tended to emphasize the romantic elements and minimize the structural cruelty of what Douglas Crane had attempted. Jane was not entirely satisfied with this, but she understood it as the way things went, and she accepted it with the equanimity she applied to most things she could not change while working persistently on the things she could. Gerald Whitmore announced in September that he was selling the store, not to anyone outside but to Jane, with favorable terms arranged through James Whitfield that reflected both her years of service and Gerald's genuine affection for her. This was unexpected and moved her considerably more than she showed. Gerald had been, she thought, the first piece of solid ground she had found when she arrived in Dusty Creek, and the fact that he was entrusting her with the thing he had built over 20 years was not something she took lightly. Gerald moved to his daughter's family in Kansas at the end of October, 1 year almost exactly after Jane's arrival in Dusty Creek. He left the pencil he had chewed for 20 years on the corner of the desk. She kept it there. Whitmore's general store became Harper Ashford Supply, though in common usage it remained simply the store, because Dusty Creek was not a town that went in for long names when short ones would serve. Joseph, who had been watching Jane manage this process from the background, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known something before everyone else did, helped with the physical work of the transition, and occasionally came in to sit at the counter when she was busy in the back, which meant that the store got a new generation of twice-weekly visitors who came in ostensibly for supplies, and spent an extended portion of their time in conversation with Joseph Ashford. He came home one evening in November, knocked the dust from his coat on the porch, and came inside to find Jane at the kitchen table with the store accounts and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was working. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked over at the columns of figures, and she leaned back against him briefly before straightening up. "You're going to be up until midnight with those," he said. "Only until 10, she said. "The Henderson's credit account needs a full reconciliation and it's been bothering me for a week." "Then I'll make fresh coffee," he said. She looked up at him. There was something in the ordinary tenderness of that response, "I'll make coffee," that she thought could have gone unnoticed, that she was profoundly glad she did not let go unnoticed. "Joseph," she said, "I'm very happy." He looked at her with that expression she had first seen across a wooden counter in October of the previous year, the one that was not quite a smile and contained more than a smile. "Good," he said. "So am I." He made the coffee. She finished the Henderson account by 9:45. They sat by the stove for another hour before bed, and she read from the book she had borrowed from the small library that the church had assembled, and he sharpened a harness fitting that needed attention, and it was entirely ordinary, and it was everything. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one, as winters in the Texas Panhandle had a way of being, with a stretch of bitter cold in January that kept everyone close to their hearths and gave Jane an extended period with the store accounts that resulted in a complete overhaul of the store's credit system, a new supplier relationship she had been negotiating for 3 months, and the discovery of a small but meaningful error in the bank's quarterly statement, which the bank manager, a dignified man named Carver, acknowledged with some embarrassment and corrected promptly. In March of 1883, Jane told Joseph she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the evening because the porch was where important things tended to happen in their lives, and because she wanted to watch his face with the full light of the sunset on it when she said it. His face went through the full sequence. Surprise. Something deeper than surprise. Something that was trying to be composed and was not quite succeeding because it was too large for composure. He turned toward her on the porch and put both hands on either side of her face and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was nothing else in the world for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said, which was the first thing he said and was entirely characteristic of him, and she loved him for it specifically. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I am, in fact, better than I have ever been." He took her in his arms carefully as though she might be fragile, and she let him for a moment and then said firmly, "I'm not made of glass, Joseph." "I know," he said against her hair. He was not relaxing his grip. "You're still holding on very tight." "I know," he said again. He was, she was fairly certain, doing the thing with his face that he did not like to be observed doing, which was expressing a full and unmanaged emotion. She gave him another 30 seconds before she pulled back to look at him, which was generous. He was. "Joseph Ashford," she said, smiling. "I'm fine," he said. He was clearly not fine in the sense that he was entirely overwhelmed, and he was entirely fine in the sense that it was the right overwhelming. "When? September, I expect." "September." He said it the way you say a destination when you have been traveling for a long time. "Good. That's September is good." He was born on the 15th of September, 1883, in the ranch house with the west-facing porch, delivered by a woman named Margaret who served as the nearest thing to a midwife in the outlying territory, with Joseph in the next room in a state of barely controlled anxiety that Carlos and Pete managed through the combined application of coffee and card games that neither of them was paying any attention to. His name was Thomas William Ashford. Thomas for Joseph's father, William for Jane's. He had Joseph's dark hair and Jane's precise, watchful eyes, and he was, from his first hours in the world, absolutely and completely himself, in a way that both his parents found both astonishing and entirely appropriate. Joseph held him for the first time with the same careful, exact attention he brought to the most delicate things. The way he handled a foal, or a new piece of equipment, or a particularly difficult accounting question with both hands, entirely present. "Hello," he said to Thomas William Ashford. Thomas opened his eyes at the sound of his father's voice. "He knows you already," Jane said from the bed. Joseph looked up at her with the expression she had first catalogued in a cold, small room in March of 1882, the one that was beyond the ordinary range, and she returned it. And across the distance of the room, and everything they had both carried, and everything they had both put down, and everything they had found here, they looked at each other and their son. The months that followed were the busy, overwhelming, joyful months that follow the arrival of any first child, and Jane and Joseph navigated them with the practical honesty that characterized everything else in their partnership. She continued managing the store. Joseph continued managing the ranch. Thomas was minded during Jane's working hours, first by a system of careful scheduling and later by a woman named Henrietta, who had recently arrived in Dusty Creek under her own difficult circumstances, and who turned out to be, with Thomas, the kind of person who was simply good with children in a way that cannot be taught. Dusty Creek continued to grow, as Texas continued to grow in those years, the railroad bringing new traffic and new faces and new commerce and new conflict, all of it arriving on a landscape that was in the middle of a profound transformation from frontier to settlement, with all the attendant disruptions and injustices that transformation carried with it. Jane was not a woman who watched injustice without response, and the store became, over time, one of the places in Dusty Creek where that response organized itself, not dramatically, but in the accumulating way that social change works, through small, consistent acts of ordinary decency. She extended credit to families that other establishments would not serve. She hired over the years without much fanfare and without a great deal of the explanation that others seemed to feel was owed to them, people that other employers in the town would not consider. She was not a crusader, by temperament. She was too practical and too private for that. But she was clear about what was fair and she acted accordingly, and the store reflected her values in the way that any institution reflects the character of the person running it. Joseph, on the ranch, was doing something similar in his own way, in his dealings with the workers who passed through, and in the positions he took in the range disputes that were the endless background music of Texas land ownership in those years. He was not always right, but he was always honest about what he thought, which was not a universal trait, and it cost him sometimes and earned him more. Thomas grew. He grew with the speed that children grow in the early years, which always surprises everyone even though it is universal, and each stage of his growth brought its own specific quality of joy and specific quality of terror. He walked at 11 months and was into everything immediately, which required a comprehensive reorganization of the lower shelves of the store. He spoke early and at length and with great specificity about his opinions on most subjects, which everyone agreed was entirely attributable to both his parents equally. He was 4 years old when Jane told Joseph, on the west porch, in the evening light, that she was expecting again. The second child was a girl born in the spring of 1888, named Clara for Clara Bright in Abilene, who had been the first person to point Jane toward Dusty Creek, and whose name Jane had been meaning to honor for years. Clara Jane Ashford arrived with a full complement of dark curls and Joseph's steady, measuring expression, and was from the first day a person of considerable opinion and unshakable calm, which her parents found profoundly recognizable. Thomas received the arrival of his sister with the practical generosity of a 5-year-old who had been preparing for months and had a specific plan for her education. He began teaching her things almost immediately, including several things that were either inaccurate or entirely made up, which Jane noted and gently corrected, and which Joseph thought was funny in a way he mostly managed not to show. They were 6 and 1 when something arrived that Jane had not expected. A letter from Abilene, not from Martha Greer, not from any familiar source. From a woman Jane did not know, a woman named Alice, who wrote to say that she was Clara Bright's niece, and that Clara had died in January at the age of 67 peacefully, and had asked before she died that Jane Harper, she had used Jane's old name, not knowing about the marriage, be informed, and be told that Clara had been glad to have helped her, and had followed with satisfaction the reports she received of how things had gone in Dusty Creek. Jane sat with that letter at the kitchen table for a long time. Clara Bright had been the first domino. If Clara had not directed her toward Dusty Creek, she would have gone somewhere else, and the chain of events that had led to the store and Gerald and Joseph and Thomas and Clara and this kitchen table on this evening in the late autumn of 1889. All of it would have been different, would have been something else entirely, and she would not have been here. She wrote back to Alice a letter of considerable length, telling her about the store and the ranch and the children and expressing, as precisely as she could manage, what Clara's intervention had meant. She sent it with a note to Alice that said, "She was a woman who built things. What she built continues." She put the bone-handled knife her father had given her, the one she had carried in her carpetbag from Missouri to Abilene to Dusty Creek, that she had kept in the small table by her side of the bed, on the kitchen shelf where it could be seen. It had always been about safety, and her understanding of safety had changed considerably. She wanted it visible. Joseph found it there that evening when he came in, and looked at it for a moment with the slight smile that meant he understood something without needing to ask. "Good placement," he said. "I thought so," she said. The years at the end of the 1880s and into the 1890s were years of increasing change in the Panhandle. As the open-range cattle era that had defined the territory gave way to fenced land and railroad commerce, and a different kind of frontier, one that was becoming, gradually and sometimes painfully, something closer to what people usually mean when they say civilization. The ranch grew, slowly and steadily in the Ashford manner. No sudden ambitious expansion, no dangerous debts, no schemes. Joseph added land when the price was right and he had the cash. And when Carlos and Pete eventually moved on, Carlos to his own small place south of Dusty Creek, Pete back east to Ohio with the woman he had married in 1886. He found and trained new hands with the same careful, patient approach he brought to everything. The store grew differently, responding to a larger commercial ecosystem. Jane brought in a woman named Betsy to help with the counter work in 1886, and in 1890 added a second woman named Louisa, who had an exceptional facility with inventory. The business that had been Whitmore's general store had become something considerably more substantial. Not a merchant operation exactly, but the commercial anchor of a community, the place where the economic life of a significant portion of Dusty Creek organized itself. Thomas, at 9, had strong opinions about horses and mathematics, both of which he had inherited or developed, and spent his afternoons between the store and the ranch with the easy mobility of a child who has two distinct domains and is entirely at home in both. Clara, at 4, had strong opinions about everything, which her family found both charming and occasionally exhausting, and had already demonstrated a gift for reading that her mother recognized with a specific satisfaction. It was Thomas who found the old letters. He was 11, and he was not supposed to be in the cedar chest at the back of his parents' room, but he was, in the way that children are in places they are not supposed to be, and he found the bundle of letters at the bottom, tied with a piece of string, and brought them to the kitchen with the direct, curious, completely unapologetic manner that was entirely his own. "What are these?" he said. Jane looked at the bundle. She recognized them, the early letters from James Whitfield, a few from Gerald after he moved to Kansas, one from Martha Greer, and the one from Douglas Crane that she had folded and put in her pocket on the morning of her wedding, which she had never thrown away because she had thought, all those years ago and occasionally since, because keeping it was part of knowing the truth of what she had come through. "Letters from before you were born," she said. "Can I read them?" "Not yet," she said. "Some of them are for when you're older. The others are just old accounts." He accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has been given honest answers by his parents and has learned to trust that the honest answers will continue to come. He put the bundle on the table and went outside. Joseph came in an hour later, found the bundle, and looked at Jane. "He found the cedar chest," she said. He looked at the top letter, which was Whitfield's first response from Amarillo. "What did you tell him?" "That they're from before he was born, that some are for when he's older." "That's true. I know, she had been thinking since Thomas had come in with his hands full of the past. Joseph, do you think we should, when they're old enough? Tell them everything. Yes, he sat down at the table. I think so, he said. I think you tell children the truth about where they come from, not to burden them with it, but so they know what their parents are made of. Jane looked at him. What we're made of, she said. What you're made of, he said with a directness that was, she thought, possibly the most specifically loving thing he had ever said to her. You're the one who walked into this. I was already here. You walked the length of an aisle to come and get me, she said. Small sacrifice, he said. It wasn't small, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand he had taken at the back of the church 11 years ago. His hands were older now, with the marks of those 11 years in them, and so were hers. No, he said. It wasn't small. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat in the kitchen with the bundle of old letters on the table between them and the sound of Thomas outside, doing something energetic, and Clara singing to herself somewhere in the back of the house, and the late afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and the bone-handled knife on the shelf. In 1893, Thomas Ashford turned 10 years old and received, from his mother on his birthday, a small leather-bound account book and a detailed explanation of how to read a balance sheet, which he absorbed with complete attention, and immediately began applying to a hypothetical trading enterprise involving the other children in town. Joseph, who received a report of this from Louisa at the store, came home trying not to laugh and told Jane, and they sat on the porch and laughed together in the evening as the Panhandle sky went through its colors. In 1894, Clara Ashford turned 6 and received, from her father, her first reading lesson in Spanish, which Carlos had been teaching Joseph for years, and which Joseph had decided Clara should have, because the world was bigger than English, and the people in it deserved that acknowledgement. Clara received this information with the calm certainty of a child who has never been told there are things she cannot learn, and within 2 months was conducting bilingual conversations with the ranch hands that left everyone slightly awed. In 1895, Jane was 40 years old. She stood on the west porch of the ranch house on the morning of her birthday in September and looked out at the Panhandle, which was in one of its exceptional autumn moods, the sky a specific deep blue that seemed to have no ceiling, the grass still dry gold, the air carrying the first edge of the coming cool. She had a cup of coffee in both hands. Joseph was still inside, doing the thing he always did on her birthday, which was making a breakfast that was substantially larger than a weekday breakfast required, and which Thomas and Clara had been enlisted to help with, and from inside came the intermittent sound of cookware and the children arguing amiably about something that she was not, from this distance, able to make out. 40 years. She ran it across in her mind, not with the anxious audit of a life that had not gone well, but with the particular kind of attention she gave to accounts that were in good order, noting things, acknowledging them, appreciating the balance. She had arrived in Dusty Creek at 24 with $22 and a bone-handled knife and no plan worth the name. She had a store that employed 3 women and served half the commercial life of a growing town. She had a house with a west-facing porch. She had Thomas, who was 12, and had recently developed a theory about cattle futures that had actual merit. She had Clara, who was 7 and was reading 3 years beyond her age, and had taken to sitting in on the reading sessions at the church schoolhouse with the unquestionable authority of a person who belongs wherever she is. She had Joseph Ashford, who was inside her kitchen making pancakes on her birthday. The door opened behind her. "Coffee's ready," Thomas said, which was the announcement he had been sent to deliver. "I have coffee," she said, holding up her cup. "Papa said the coffee inside is better. Papa is trying to get me off the porch." "Probably," Thomas agreed. There was a pause. He came and stood beside her, looking out at the same view, which she found touching because he was 12 and 12-year-old boys had better things to do than stand on porches. "Mama." "Carlos told me," he said carefully, "that Papa asked you to marry him while you were dealing with a bad situation, that he did it to help you." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky. "Carlos knows a version of the story," she said. "What did he say exactly?" "He said Papa asked you when things were hard because he could see you needed someone in your corner and that the helping wasn't the reason, but it was the reason he stopped waiting." She considered that. "Carlos," she said, "has a fairly accurate understanding of events. So is it true that you were in a bad situation?" "Yes," she said. "Was it because of a man?" He asked with the directness of his father and the precision of his mother. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. He was 12, and he was not a child who needed everything simplified. "Papa stopped it," he said. "Your father and I stopped it together," she said. "I've been working on it for months before he got involved. He helped with a piece of it, a significant piece." She paused. "The most significant piece was walking down the aisle at our wedding when I stopped at the back." Thomas looked at her now. "You stopped at the back." "I was frightened," she said. "The situation was not yet resolved. There was a man there who intended to make things difficult." "What did Papa do?" "He stood up," she said. "And he walked all the way from the front of the church to the back where I was standing, and he held out his hand." She looked at her coffee cup. "He walked the full length of that aisle," she said, "to come and get me, to tell me I didn't have to stand there alone." Thomas was silent for a long moment. She could see him working through it, filing it in the place where he kept the truest things. "I'm going to be that kind of man," he said, not dramatically but with the simple certainty of a made decision. Something moved through Jane's chest that she did not have a name for but recognized as one of the deepest feelings she was capable of. "I know you are," she said. The door opened again, and Joseph appeared, holding a plate and looking at both of them with the expression that meant he suspected something significant had happened in his absence, and was content to understand it later. "Pancakes," he said. "Coming," said Jane. She turned from the west-facing porch and went inside, and the pancakes were as good as they had smelled, and they ate breakfast together in the kitchen, all four of them, with the morning light coming through the window, and Clara explained at considerable length, and with many specific examples, the book she was currently reading. And Thomas ate 3 pancakes and proposed his cattle futures theory to his father, who engaged with it seriously. And Jane sat at the kitchen table that she had sat at for 11 years, and watched her family, and let herself be in it completely. Later that day, after the breakfast had been cleared and the children had gone to their pursuits, Joseph found Jane in the store, working on the quarterly accounts. He came in and leaned on the counter in the way he had first leaned on it 14 years ago and looked at her. "Good birthday so far," he said. "Very good," she said, without looking up from the accounts. "Thomas talked to you this morning," he said. "Yes." "About the marriage." Carlos told him things. She made a notation in the account book. "Accurate things." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his attention on her in the specific way she had always been able to feel it, the quality of his noticing, which was not intrusive but was absolute and reliable. "Do you ever think about it?" he said. "The way things went." She put down her pen and looked up at him. The light was coming through the front windows of the store, the same windows that had first framed him coming in from an October afternoon in 1881, with a list in his hand and a slight expression of surprise at finding her there. "I think about it the way you think about the foundation of a house," she said. "You don't usually stand there looking at the foundation, but you know it's there. And you know the house stands because of it." He looked at her with the full and unreserved expression that he still mostly reserved for moments when it was just the two of them. "I walked that aisle," he said, not to remind her but because he was saying it for himself, completing something. "You walked that aisle," she said. "Every step." "Would you have come forward?" he asked. It was a real question, one he had perhaps been holding for a long time. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I was very frightened. I think eventually yes, but I don't know how long I might have stood there." She paused. "It doesn't matter, you came." "It mattered to me," he said. "Every step of it mattered to me." She stood up from the desk and came around the counter, which she rarely did in the store, and stood in front of him and looked up at him. "Joseph Ashford," she said. "Jane," he said, "I have been grateful every day of the last 11 years that you were in that church. 14 years since you came through that door," he said. He looked at the door. "October, October," she agreed. He put his hands on her face, the same gesture as the day she had told him about Thomas, careful and full and absolutely present. She put her hands over his. Outside, Dusty Creek conducted its afternoon business. The sun was doing its thing with the panhandle sky. Somewhere down the street, a horse registered a complaint about something. The telegraph office was clicking. Two women were having a conversation on the opposite boardwalk that appeared to involve a quantity of fabric. In the store, which had been Whitmore's general store and was now Harper Ashford's supply, which had first been the place Jane Harper put her feet on solid ground and had become something considerably more than that over 14 years, Joseph and Jane Ashford stood in the afternoon light and held each other's faces and were entirely where they were. The bone-handled knife was on the shelf at home. The old letters were in the cedar chest. The west-facing porch was waiting. Thomas was somewhere between the store and the ranch, running calculations on cattle futures. Clara was reading 2 years ahead in the church schoolhouse, explaining things to everyone. And the aisle of the little church was empty and quiet in the Tuesday morning April light, as aisles are when the ceremony is long over and the congregation has gone home, and the only evidence of what happened there is the closed doors that let in the sunlight when they open, and the worn wood of the pews, and the slight marks on the floorboards where a man's boots went, one in front of the other, from the front of the church to the back, to the woman standing in the doorway and came back again. Together. They had come back together and they had been together, and they were together still, in the store on a September afternoon in 1895, with the accounts on the desk and the panhandle sky doing what it did outside, and 11 years of a house and a life and 2 children behind them, and more years ahead, and all of it built on that walk, that hand, that one word that had been her name. She leaned her forehead against his chest. He put his arms around her. "We should go home," he said after a while. "The accounts will keep until tomorrow." She thought about this for approximately 2 seconds. "Yes," she said, "they will." They walked out of the store together, into the September afternoon, and the door closed behind them, and the light lay gold and long across the dusty Creek Street. And it was the most ordinary and most extraordinary evening of a life that had been built from courage and honesty, and the faith that a person can start over, and that sometimes the beginning of starting over is one person walking toward you when you have stopped, walking the full length of whatever distance stands between you. And holding out their hand, Jane Harper had taken that hand. And everything after, the house and the store and Thomas and Clara and the west-facing porch and the bone-handled knife on the shelf and the morning light through the kitchen window and all the ordinary days and all the better-than-ordinary ones and all the ones still coming, everything after had been built on that. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.